Put your hands on the dashboard, or I'll give you a reason to. Bradley Knox's voice cut through the quiet morning like a blade. His pistol was already drawn, pointed directly at the chest of a black man wearing a dark navy blue polo shirt, standing beside his parked SUV outside a federal military facility in Virginia. For several seconds, nobody moved. The summer heat shimmered above the asphalt, the distant hum of traffic mixing with the sharp static of a police radio, while Calvin Jackson stared calmly at the barrel aimed at him. He did not raise his voice. He did not step back, but he also did not obey blindly. "Officer," Calvin said, his eyes fixed on Knox, "you stopped me without telling me what law I broke. I gave you my license. I gave you my registration. What exactly are you accusing me of?" Knox's jaw tightened. "Don't play smart with me." "I'm not playing anything," Calvin replied. "I'm asking a reasonable question." That answer seemed to irritate Knox more than any insult could have. The officer stepped closer, one hand gripping his weapon while the other hovered near his radio. He had expected fear. He had expected the usual silence that came when a civilian saw a gun and realized who controlled the situation. Instead, Calvin kept correcting him, calmly, precisely, one mistake at a time. "You said I matched the description," Calvin continued. "Then tell me the description." Knox's eyes narrowed. "Black male, dark shirt, military area." Calvin almost smiled. "That describes half the people in this parking lot." The silence that followed felt heavier. Two officers near the patrol car exchanged a quick glance. Somewhere behind them, a camera mounted above the facility entrance blinked red. "Recording." Knox noticed it, then looked back at Calvin. "You think you're funny?" "No," Calvin said. "I think you're angry because I'm not giving you a reason to escalate this." That was the moment Knox's expression changed. His face hardened. His breathing became heavier. The gun lifted slightly higher. Calvin saw it. So did everyone else. Imagine standing there, knowing one wrong movement could turn a misunderstanding into something irreversible, and still refusing to let another man rewrite the truth in front of you. Calvin slowly raised both hands, but his voice remained steady. "You're making a mistake, Officer Knox." Knox sneered. "You have no idea who you're talking to." Calvin looked directly into his eyes. "Actually, I think I'm beginning to." And Bradley Knox had no idea how badly those words would come back to haunt him. "You had one chance to explain yourself, officer. Now you're creating evidence against yourself." Calvin's words landed quietly, but Bradley Knox heard every syllable. For a moment, the officer simply stared at him, as if trying to decide whether Calvin was fearless or foolish. Then his grip tightened around the pistol. "Turn around," Knox ordered. "Hands behind your back." Calvin did not move. "For what?" "You're being detained." "On what grounds?" Calvin asked immediately. Knox's face darkened. "I already told you. You match a description. And I already told you that description is vague." Calvin nodded toward the patrol car. "You have my identification. You ran my plates. You know exactly who owns the vehicle. So what changed?" Knox stepped closer. "Your attitude." Calvin's eyes narrowed slightly. "My attitude isn't a legal reason to detain me." One of the younger officers standing nearby shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at Knox, then at the body camera attached to his chest. The tiny red light was still blinking. Calvin noticed it too. He pointed toward it with his chin. "Good. Keep that running." Knox immediately snapped. "Don't tell me how to do my job." "Then do it correctly," Calvin replied. The younger officer looked away. Knox's nostrils flared. He had spent years commanding situations with intimidation, and people usually folded before he needed to raise his voice. But Calvin wasn't folding. Every accusation Knox made was met with a question. Every order was met with a demand for lawful justification. Every exaggeration was corrected before it could become part of the record. "Get on your knees," Knox suddenly barked. Calvin stared at him. "Why?" "Because I said so." "That isn't an explanation." Knox took another step forward. "You're resisting." Calvin slowly shook his head. "No, I'm standing still and asking you questions." The younger officer swallowed hard. He knew what was happening. Knox was losing control, and Calvin knew it too. But there was something else about Calvin that neither officer understood. He wasn't simply defending himself. He was watching, listening, remembering every word, every command, every contradiction, the location, the time, the witnesses, the camera, all of it. Knox suddenly reached toward Calvin's arm. Calvin stepped back half-pace. "Don't touch me unless you have lawful grounds." Knox froze. Then his voice dropped into something colder. "You really think you can lecture me out here?" Calvin looked at the gun, then back into Knox's eyes. "No," he paused. "I think you're going to make your next mistake without me having to do anything." Knox's expression hardened, and somewhere behind them, another patrol car began approaching fast. "You keep asking who I am, officer. The better question is why you're so desperate not to find out." The approaching patrol car slowed behind Bradley Knox, its headlights washing across the asphalt as another officer stepped out, one hand resting near his belt. For a brief second, Knox glanced over his shoulder, then turned back toward Calvin Jackson as if the arrival had only strengthened his authority. "Last warning," Knox said. "Get on your knees." Calvin's expression did not change. No, the single word seemed to hit Knox harder than a shout. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Calvin replied. "I will cooperate with a lawful order. I will not pretend an unlawful one becomes legitimate because you're holding a weapon." The younger officer looked at Calvin carefully now. There was something unusual about the man's composure. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't panicking. He stood with the controlled posture of someone accustomed to pressure, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing measured, his eyes constantly observing. Even the way he kept his hands visible seemed deliberate. Knox noticed the same thing and hated it. "You think that shirt and that calm voice make you special?" he sneered, glancing at Calvin's dark navy blue polo. "You're still standing in front of my gun." Calvin looked down briefly at the weapon, then back up. "And you're still pointing it at a man who has given you no reason to." The younger officer shifted uneasily. "Bradley, maybe we should stay out of it." Knox snapped the words so sharply that the other officer fell silent. Calvin watched the exchange. Another mistake. Another witness. Another moment recorded. He glanced toward the entrance camera again, then toward the body camera on the younger officer's chest. "Officer Knox," he said, "you've already changed your explanation twice. First, I matched the description. Then it became my attitude. Now you're treating my refusal to kneel as resistance. Which version are you putting in your report?" Knox's face reddened. "You don't write my report." "No," Calvin said, "but I can read it." Silence. Knox stared at him. For the first time, something flickered behind his anger. Suspicion. Who was this man? Why did he speak like someone who understood procedure? Why wasn't he afraid? But before Knox could ask, Calvin's phone vibrated inside his pocket. Knox immediately pointed the gun higher. "Don't move." Calvin froze. "It's a phone." "I said don't move." "Then check your own body camera," Calvin answered. "You'll see exactly what I did." Knox's breathing became heavier. His finger shifted dangerously close to the trigger. The younger officer took one cautious step forward. "Bradley, lower the weapon." Knox snapped. "I said stay back." And that was when Calvin finally understood something. Bradley Knox wasn't simply making mistakes anymore. He was losing control. "Lower that weapon, Bradley. Right now. Because the next decision you make will be yours alone." For the first time, Calvin Jackson's voice carried something different. Not fear, not anger, but unmistakable authority. The parking lot seemed to hold its breath. Wind moved through the trees beyond the security fence, carrying the faint smell of hot asphalt and gasoline, while the red lights from the patrol cars painted flashes across Calvin's dark navy blue polo. Bradley Knox stared at him, breathing heavily, his face flushed with frustration. "You don't give me orders," he shouted. Calvin didn't move. "Then stop behaving. Like you're above the law." That sentence pushed Knox over another line. He stepped forward and shoved Calvin hard in the chest. The younger officer immediately reacted. "Bradley." Calvin took one step backward, regained his balance, and looked down at the hand that had touched him. Then he looked back at Knox. "You just assaulted me. I told you to cooperate." Knox yelled. "I have cooperated from the beginning," Calvin replied. "You're the one escalating." Knox pointed the gun toward him again. "Get on the ground." Calvin shook his head. "Not until you explain why." "Because I said so. That isn't enough." The younger officer looked increasingly alarmed. Bradley, put the gun away. We can handle this without. Shut up, Knox barked. His voice echoed across the parking lot. A security guard near the entrance had stopped moving. Two employees were watching from behind the glass doors. Everyone could see it now. This was no longer a routine traffic stop. It had become something else. Something dangerous. Calvin slowly turned his head toward the cameras above the entrance. Make sure they preserve the footage, he said. Knox heard him. What footage? All of it. Knox's eyes narrowed. Who do you think you are? Calvin looked directly at him. Someone who warned you 3 times. Knox's hand tightened around the weapon. You keep talking like you're untouchable. No, gotta be nonsense. I keep talking because you keep making mistakes. The words were calm, but they struck Knox like a slap. He stepped closer. You think that badge means nothing? Calvin replied. It means something. It means you have a responsibility. That's why what you're doing matters. For a moment, the younger officer looked at Calvin as if he finally understood that this man wasn't simply another civilian caught in a confrontation. There was discipline in his posture, experience in his eyes, and an almost unsettling certainty that this moment would not end the way Knox expected. Then a voice crackled over the radio. Unit 12, command wants your location confirmed. Knox reached for his radio without lowering the gun. Calvin watched him carefully. Tell them exactly where you are. Knox ignored him, but the radio crackled again. Officer Knox, respond. And suddenly, Bradley realized something terrifying. Someone important was already watching. You should call your supervisor, Officer Knox, because every second you keep that gun raised is making your situation worse. Calvin Jackson said it without raising his voice, and somehow that calmness made Bradley Knox even angrier. The radio on Knox's shoulder crackled again, demanding an answer, but he ignored it. His attention remained locked on Calvin. You don't tell me what to do. Knox snapped. I'm the officer here. Calvin nodded toward the body camera. Then act like one. The words hung in the hot morning air. Knox's face tightened. He lowered the gun for only a moment, just enough to reach for his radio. Control, I have a non-compliant male refusing lawful commands. Calvin immediately corrected him. That is false. Knox stopped. What did you say? I said that is false. I have complied with every reasonable instruction you gave me. You asked for my identification. I gave it to you. You asked where I was going. I answered. You ordered me to keep my hands visible. They have been visible the entire time. The younger officer looked down at his own camera. Calvin continued. And you never explained the specific offense that justified drawing your weapon. Knox stared at him. You think a technicality is going to save you? No, the truth will. Something changed in the air. The security guard near the entrance quietly stepped inside and made a phone call. The second officer glanced toward the facility cameras. There were several now, one above the gate, another over the parking area, another facing the main entrance. Calvin had noticed them from the moment he arrived. He knew that whatever happened next would leave a record. Knox didn't. Or perhaps he knew and simply believed his badge would protect him. Put your hands behind your back, Knox ordered again. No, you're resisting. I'm refusing an unlawful command. There is a difference. Knox stepped forward. You're making this worse. Calvin looked him straight in the eyes. No, officer. You are. Knox's breathing became heavier. He grabbed the radio again. Control, send another unit. This time the reply came immediately. Unit 12, stand by. Command is reviewing the incident. Knox froze. Command? He repeated quietly. Calvin said nothing. The younger officer looked at him. Sir, who are you? Calvin turned his eyes toward him, but before he could answer, the radio crackled once more. Officer Knox, identify the individual involved. Knox hesitated. He looked at Calvin, then at the camera above the gate. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. Calvin remained completely still. He didn't need to reveal anything yet. The evidence was already accumulating. The false accusation, the threats, the weapon, the body camera, the witnesses. Knox had spent the last several minutes trying to control the scene. Without realizing it, he had been documenting the case against himself. And somewhere inside the facility, someone had just opened a secure file with one name on it, Calvin Jackson. You asked who Calvin Jackson was. The answer is sitting in a file you were never supposed to see. The voice came through the radio, so suddenly that Bradley Knox froze. For a moment, the parking lot fell silent except for the faint hum of the patrol cars and the soft crackle of static. Knox lifted his radio. Who is this? No answer came immediately. Calvin remained motionless, his hands still visible, his dark navy blue polo moving slightly in the warm wind. The younger officer stared at him, then at Knox. Something about the situation had changed. It wasn't obvious yet, but the balance of power had shifted. Calvin looked toward the facility entrance. You should listen carefully now, he said. Knox glared at him. Don't start. I'm not starting anything. I'm telling you to listen. The radio crackled again. Officer Knox, step away from the individual and secure your weapon. Knox's eyes widened. Command, I have this situation under control. Negative. You do not. The younger officer slowly lowered his hand from his belt. Knox looked furious. Who authorized that order? The response came after a brief pause. You don't need to know. Calvin almost smiled. Not because he was enjoying Knox's discomfort, but because the moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. The truth had started moving faster than Bradley's anger. Knox turned toward Calvin. What did you do? Calvin answered calmly. Nothing. He paused. That's the problem. I didn't have to. The younger officer looked confused. Calvin continued. You created this situation yourself. Every order, every accusation, every threat, every time you raised that weapon. Knox shook his head. You're trying to intimidate me. No, Calvin said. I'm reminding you that evidence doesn't become less real because you don't like what it proves. Knox's face tightened. Then the facility doors opened. A senior military officer stepped outside, followed by 2 security personnel. He walked directly toward Calvin. He didn't look at Knox first. He looked at Calvin. Then he stopped several feet away and gave a precise military salute. General Jackson. The words were quiet, but they hit Bradley Knox harder than a siren. The younger officer's mouth fell slightly open. Knox stared at Calvin as if seeing him for the first time. General Jackson, the man he'd accused, the man he'd ordered to kneel, the man he'd pointed a weapon at. Calvin finally lowered his hands. At ease, he said to the officer. Bradley's face drained of color. You're a general? Calvin looked at him steadily. Yes. Silence. No shouting. No celebration. Just silence. And then Calvin added the sentence that made Knox's stomach drop. And you were warned 3 times. The cameras were still recording. The file was already open. And now everyone was about to see exactly what Bradley Knox had done. You pointed a gun at a man you thought was powerless. Now you're going to explain every second of what you just did. General Calvin Jackson's voice remained calm, but the entire parking lot seemed to change the moment his rank became known. Bradley Knox stared at him, unable to hide the shock on his face. The man standing before him was not a confused civilian, not an ordinary driver, and certainly not someone Knox could intimidate into silence. He was a senior Army general, standing there in nothing more than a dark navy blue polo shirt, yet carrying himself with the unmistakable discipline of someone accustomed to command. Knox slowly lowered his weapon. General, he muttered. Calvin immediately raised one hand. Secure the weapon first. Knox hesitated. Sir, I secure it. This time the command was quiet but absolute. Knox slowly placed the weapon back into its holster. The younger officer exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath for minutes. Calvin turned toward him. Officer, preserve your body camera footage and remain exactly where you are. No one deletes, edits, or transfers anything. Yes, sir. Knox's face tightened. General Jackson, there's been a misunderstanding. Calvin looked at him. No, there has been a series of decisions. Knox swallowed. I received a description. Then you should have verified it. I was doing my job. Your job was to determine whether I had committed an offense, Calvin replied. Instead, you escalated before establishing one. Knox opened his mouth, but Calvin continued. You accused me without evidence. You ordered me to kneel without explaining why. You called my refusal to comply with an unlawful command resistance. Then you drew your weapon. Each sentence landed harder than the last. The security guard near the entrance remained silent, watching. The second patrol officer lowered his eyes. Even Knox's partner seemed unwilling to defend him. Calvin stepped closer, but stopped several feet away. And when I corrected you, you became angry. Knox's face reddened. I was under pressure. Calvin nodded slowly. Pressure reveals character. Silence. Then the facility doors opened again. A senior Army official emerged carrying a sealed folder. He approached Calvin and handed it to him. Calvin looked at the folder, then at Knox. You want to know why I was here? Knox said nothing. Calvin opened the folder. I was scheduled to meet command this morning regarding an internal security review. Knox's expression changed. An internal review? Yes. Calvin closed the folder. And now I have something else to review. Knox stared at the cameras around the parking lot. The realization finally reached him. His actions had not disappeared into a routine police report. They had become part of an official record. Calvin looked directly into his eyes. You wanted to know who you were dealing with. He paused. Now you do. And for the first time that morning, Bradley Knox looked genuinely afraid. You pointed a gun at a general, but that may not be the worst mistake you made today. The sentence came from the senior Army official standing beside Calvin Jackson, and Bradley Knox felt the last trace of confidence leave his face. The parking lot had become strangely quiet. The patrol lights continued flashing against the concrete, but nobody spoke. Calvin opened the sealed folder once more. Inside were preliminary documents for the security review, along with a list of incidents that had already raised concerns about local law enforcement conduct around the facility. He looked at Knox. This review was supposed to begin with paperwork, Calvin said. Now it begins with you. Knox immediately shook his head. General, I can explain. You already did, Calvin replied. Several times. The younger officer lowered his eyes. The body camera was still recording. The entrance cameras were still running. The witnesses were still standing there. Knox suddenly realized that there was nowhere left for his version of events to hide. I believed you were suspicious, he said. Calvin nodded. Belief is not evidence. You refused to cooperate. I corrected your statements. You challenged my authority. Calvin's expression hardened. Authority is not the same thing as immunity. Silence. That sentence seemed to settle over the entire scene. The senior Army official turned toward Knox. Officer, step away from your vehicle. Knox hesitated. Am I being arrested? Not by us, the official answered. But your department has been notified. Knox's radio immediately crackled. Unit 12, place your weapon on the hood and step away. Knox looked at Calvin. You called them? Calvin shook his head. No. He pointed toward the cameras. They watched. Knox slowly removed his weapon and placed it on the hood. The sound of metal touching steel seemed strangely loud. For a moment, he stood there without his weapon, without the intimidation he had relied on, without the certainty that his badge would shield him. Calvin walked closer. Do you remember what you said when you first stopped me? Knox remained silent. You said I should know who you were dealing with. Calvin paused. You were right. Knox looked up. Calvin continued. But you misunderstood which one of us needed to be afraid. A second patrol car arrived. Then another. Supervisors stepped out. Nobody rushed toward Calvin. They walked directly toward Knox. The younger officer handed over his body camera footage without hesitation. I recorded everything, he said. Knox closed his eyes for a moment. Karma had not arrived with violence. It arrived with paperwork, witnesses, recordings, and consequences. Calvin watched quietly as the officer who had once pointed a gun at him was escorted away for investigation. Then Calvin turned toward the cameras above the entrance. Let the record show, he said, that accountability began the moment someone finally refused to stay silent. Bradley Knox thought losing his badge was the punishment. He was wrong. The real punishment was making every victim finally believe they could speak. The afternoon sun was beginning to soften over the facility as Calvin Jackson stood near the entrance, watching the patrol cars disappear one by one. The tension that had filled the parking lot earlier was gone, replaced by an unusual stillness. The cameras had stopped recording the confrontation, but the evidence they captured would continue moving through the system. Knox had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, his weapon secured, his body camera footage preserved, and his conduct referred for formal review. But Calvin knew this story was never supposed to be about one officer losing a badge. It was about what happened when someone finally refused to let intimidation become the truth. The younger officer approached slowly. "General Jackson?" Calvin turned. "Yes. I just wanted to say, I should have stepped in sooner." Calvin studied him for a moment. "Then remember this moment." The officer nodded. "When you see something wrong, don't wait until it becomes dangerous. Before you decide it matters." The words stayed with him. Across the parking lot, the security guard who had witnessed everything stood quietly near the gate. He had seen the gun. He had heard the accusations. He had watched Calvin correct Knox again and again without losing control. But there was one thing he would remember most. Calvin had never needed to shout to prove his strength. He had simply refused to surrender the truth. Imagine standing in Calvin's place. Imagine being judged before anyone asked your name. Imagine having a weapon pointed at you while knowing that one emotional reaction could be used against you. And then imagine choosing something harder than anger. Choosing control. Choosing truth. Choosing accountability. That was the lesson Calvin wanted to leave behind. Not revenge. Not humiliation. Justice. Before leaving, he turned toward the younger officer one final time. "Make sure the footage is preserved." "It will be, sir." Calvin nodded and walked toward the facility doors. His navy blue polo disappeared into the shadow of the entrance, but the meaning of what happened remained behind. Bradley Knox had believed his badge gave him power over Calvin Jackson. Instead, his own actions had exposed the weakness behind that badge. And perhaps that was the greatest karma of all. The man who tried to silence someone became the evidence that finally gave others a voice. Because justice does not always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wearing no uniform, carrying no weapon, and simply refusing to look away. If you believe everyone deserves dignity, accountability, and equal treatment under the law, remember this. A badge can command attention, but only integrity deserves respect. So ask yourself, what would you do if you witnessed injustice happening right in front of you? Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.